Cool. So beginning with our Job 5, 6 through 7, for evil does not come up from the dust, nor does trouble spring up from the ground. But people are born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. And probably any other book of the Bible, everybody connects with Job as a place of mourning and grief, as the man who lost everything, right? So the nature of grief. Grieving is part of being human. God designed us in such a manner that we are able to become attached to both people and objects. And depending on how important these are to us, we experience sadness and hurt when we lose them. Grief helps us separate from a lost person or object. So if a loved one dies, for example, grief allows us to adjust to life without the loved one. Ideally, humans advance through the grief process to the point of being able to function without the object of grief. As we talk tonight, we'll talk about some reasons that we've talked about a bit already of why that can be prolonged. Grief, as mentioned, is not a simple single entity that can be easily described. In fact, there's great variability in the grief process. No universal correct mode of grieving applies to all individuals in all circumstances. Grief, though it is a process, is not formulaic, so there's not a one-size-fits-all plan. Grief is restorative. People don't often think about grief as being a restoration, but it's a sobering recognition of the soul that something or someone of value has been marred, removed, or lost with nothing to replace it or restore it to its original design. And that's in keeping with, God's mourning, right? That his original creation, his original plan, isn't lived out the way that he intended. The way that grief is experienced is related to the loss situation or the circumstances producing the grief process. So the death of a casual acquaintance, for example, would usually not have as great an impact as with the death of a close relative. A sudden and tragic death of a young person affects the bereaved far differently than does the expected death of an older adult. So as Jan talked about her dad tonight, right? Of course, he's surprised that he's grieving, but he's been married for 60 years. That's a lot of years of grieving, recognizing that, his spouse is no longer there. The events surrounding a loss.
Kelly?
Yeah.
I'm not sure where you're at.
I'm got my own little notes here, so they're not all going to be on your notes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Can you direct us when you're on to our notes? Can you let us know when you're reading from our notes?
I'll try to.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the events surrounding the loss dictate at least some components of how an individual experiences grief. So next, this should be a paragraph that's in your notes. Expressions of grief. How do we express grief? What does that look like? So following a loss, should a person be stoic and unemotional? You guys have all experienced people in different phases of grief, yes? So what are some of the expressions that you've seen?
Like they're there, but they're not really there. There's a distance.
Mm-hmm. So disconnectedness.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So some behaviors associated with grief, are they right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable? Expressions of grief vary greatly. No two individuals grieve in precisely the same manner. Part of the caregiver's task is to support the hurting person according to the unique manner in which that person experiences and expresses grief.
Something that I experienced was interesting to me. I didn't even realize it, but I was sitting and I can't remember. I think it was when my mom was in the process of dying, I think. Or maybe, yeah, I think that's when it was. And I was just sitting and looking or something. I don't know. And I went, and my best friend said, Jan, you look so sad. And I didn't even know, it's so like when you're grieving, sometimes you don't even realize. I mean, that was my experience. I had no idea that on my outward expression
mm-hmm.
was mirroring what was happening inside of me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And think about, if somebody would come along and say, wow, Jan, you really need to put a smile on your face while you're going through that, right? Think about how dismissive that would sound to you, right? I don't know if it's in our notes or not, but the 5 stages of grief, have you guys heard that term?
That's not no, I haven't.
Warren, will you tell us what those are? Because I don't have them memorized intentionally, but.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about it last week, that what's her name? Catherine Kubler-Ross. She was a palliative care nurse.
Oh yeah, we did talk about that. That's what Kelly's referring to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, it's denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And the premise in that, that is left with some people very much like titles and other things in secular psychology is that if you don't hit all those stages, then you're not grieving properly. And that's not always true.
There's also the thing that, well, you're here, so this is where you'll be next.
Exactly. And I've seen it all over the place doing my work with the trauma organization that I work with. And sometimes people are, happy. Sometimes there's huge relief. I don't know how many of you have heard Robert's story, but when I met him, he was at the tail end of several years of grieving his first wife and ultimately lost her to cancer. And he was ready to move on. He'd already been grieving for the years before that. So it's very different for every human. So grief has no end. There has been loss. Coming to a place where an individual understands better as they get more clarity of how they were or were not connected to the person they lost reveals deeper layers in the grieving process, deeper revelations of what or wasn't lost. So when you hear that, what do you think of? Why would somebody grieve what wasn't there?
Imagination kicks in.
Okay, say more about that.
So are you asking,
Jan, Raul, say more about that. What do you mean imagination?
Because sometimes you think about it so much that you have a problem differentiating reality from the dreams that you have.
Okay, so the dreams of what could have been.
What could have been, yeah. Or what you could have, or times that you had with the person they may not be real anymore. The dreams they were.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jan, what were you going to say? Sorry.
Well, I think that if you say a girl never had a good relationship with her dad, or it was, he abandoned her, or, the family or whatever not, then the death permanently ends that hope that could ever come to pass. And so you have to not, and then you grieve what you grieve the loss of what you never got that you should have gotten, I would guess.
Mm-hmm. Or that you felt that you were entitled to. or that, yeah, by God's design, by what you see other people's having, those kind of things. There's a whole lot that goes into where that comes from. Do you think it's always based on truth?
No. One question. These, is that focusing on death rather?
You
Sorry,
guys keep cutting out.
When we're talking about grief, are we talking about just death or anything else connected or similar to death?
It can be any, so grief is, you know, the loss of something, someone, so it doesn't have to be death.
So like, for example, a job, loss of a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, because I see that with, again, the person that I was trying to counsel with. He lost his job and he keeps on repeating things and he keeps on, I think, imagining situations I doubt ever happened, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that thin line between reality and expectations and dreams.
Right. Yeah, and you're describing a really great example of somebody who has probably put a lot of hope and a lot of expectation in that if I only have this, then all these things will come true on the other side, right? So what do we call that in biblical counseling world?
Potential.
Entitlement.
Okay, you're getting closer.
Who's getting closer?
Both of you. It's a team effort. So if our heart is worshiping something.
Well, that would be idolatry.
Right. So it can turn to that, right? So we don't start there. Obviously, we would spend, you know, significant amount of time with somebody before we're able to help them recognize that they are putting something that they're grieving in a higher place than where God is in their life. There's a reason that God closed that door, right? So helping them get from that point. Obviously, we're going to dig more into that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me say one thing. We have to understand too, though, that when you've got the little girl who's 12 years old and loses dad to disease or accident or something like that, when she gets ready to graduate or when she gets ready to learn to drive, dad's supposed to be there to be part of that. That's God's design.
Mm-hmm.
So her not experiencing that, and God not being there is a legitimate loss. Because remember, she lost something that loss was a violation of God's created order. So that's still a legitimate loss that she's going to need to be able to grieve through. When she goes to get married, dad's not going to walk down the aisle with her. He's not going to be there to when she gets ready to go on her first date or to take pictures of her on her prom date, or there's all kinds of things. When she gets ready to have her first child,
Mm-hmm.
right? Dad's not going to be there to celebrate that or for her to be able to share that with. That's a legitimate loss.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not just imagine. That is a real loss because
Yes.
God's design was for dad to be there for them to experience.
Right. Right.
Does that apply also to pets?
No.
Sorry.
Okay, so I have a question, and I don't know if it lands here or if it lands anywhere. But when you're talking about, you know, you're grieving, you know, the example I was given, like, or even, you know, like, I've had watched people before, like, they had like an awful parent, whatever that, you know, parent, whichever parent it was. Awful, just terrible. I mean, I know the stories because they shared them with me. And then it comes to their funeral, and you would think by the way their adult child spoke about them, they were like this awesome parent. And I'm like, I obviously you can't go at someone's funeral and say, well, you can, but this was the worst dad ever, blah, blah, blah. You know, I get that. But they rim it. So is that a part of kind of grieving something that wasn't, they cling on to only the few good memories, and then when they're talking, they act like that was like the best person ever when they actually weren't. Am I even making sense?
I think there's a couple of things at work. Okay. Mm-hmm. One is they don't want to have to admit out loud in front of all these people how bad that parent was, because that means the parent didn't love them enough to be different than they were. Mm-hmm. Okay. But there's another thing at work too, is that and again, there's probably more than these, but these two are usually the most common. The other thing is that if they are completely honest about how horrible this parent was, okay, that leaves them in a state of hopelessness, because we get our sense of identity from our parents. And so, I mean, I can say anything I want to about my dad or my sisters, but you say anything about, well, I'll probably agree with you. But most often, right? Most often, I can say anything about my sister I want, but if you insult her, we're going to Fifth City, type of thing, right?
Yeah.
So those are what I've found, and I've done more funerals than weddings. Mm-hmm. And those are the two that I usually find most often at work. There's some other small, more subtle ones sometimes, but those are the two that I found to be most common.
Yeah. Yeah, those are both good points. So general expressions, personality type, being humid, wow. Human, too much time in Florida. Fluid in shape, changes. So fluid in shape meaning chameleon-like. So just kind of going with the flow and the feel of what everybody else is presenting, which is really, they've checked out, or they don't want to make waves. They don't really know how they feel yet. Their personality can change going through grief. So Jan, as you described, your friend observing that you just looked so sad, right? Which is not your normal personality. Being stoic, expressive, demonstrative. So changes in personality can definitely occur through grief.
And some of those personality changes will not go back to what they were. Mm-hmm. So personality is not static the way personality types in the Jungian psychological theory of personality types. Mm-hmm. Personality is fluid and things shape that. Loss and grief can shape personality and change it. You can have somebody who used to be vibrant and gregarious, and they have 3 losses in the space of 2 years, and they are melancholy and sullen and...
Yeah, happened to my dad and my mom. I passed away. Never changed. They completely changed. They never went.
Mm-hmm. So family influences in family can be very strong. So depending on how it's been modeled or how the family responds to grief is typically how we will respond. And there's all sorts of different dynamics that show up in that. Warren can talk more about that in a minute. So spoken and unspoken family responses can have a significant impact on the rules of grief. Children are especially impacted by a parent's response to their own grief. This is a really interesting subject. So I've had the pleasure of having walked a lot of adults. So three of my stepchildren have had to walk through this, and the impact of grief for them is very different and very individual for each one of them. I have a gal that I'm working with who lost her father when she was 15, but they spent most of her childhood from the ages 8 to 15 caring for him, him being in constant, him being sick the whole time. He ultimately died of the disease that he had. And being from a very conservative church upbringing, you didn't show expression. So basically, she felt so enclosed. She's a very outgoing, outspoken, very intelligent, but really felt like she was in this cocoon for much of her childhood, because there was a certain way that she needed to respond in order to appease all of the visitors coming, never really allowed to express her emotion as a child of what was going on for her as a child losing her father. It was all about, you know, the care and keeping of the visitors and keeping up church appearances, if you will. It can be very, very difficult and challenging to unwind.
Yeah, and to speak to that a little bit more, we have to understand that in that kind of a situation, she was made to deny the truth about her own experience. And over time, it gets to the place where she can't even connect with what she was made to, the role she was made to play. That becomes the reality. But there's a disconnect, there's a dissonance inside, that there's something wrong about that, but I can't articulate it anymore. So being able to walk her through that and allow the Holy Spirit to bring those things to the surface so that she really can experience the grief that she needed to experience and walk through, so that she can move on with a new equilibrium, is a very difficult process.
Super difficult. And that coupled with mom, very, very stoic, very removed from emotion. So emotions, that's the unspoken, right? We don't have emotions. They aren't valid. So
can I ask, going back to the personality, I wanted to ask it, and then I was putting eye drops, and then I couldn't unmute quick enough. When, because I couldn't see, when the person's personality changes, like you said, maybe they were gregarious and outgoing, and then they become melancholy, and, you know, does the person, and this might be as individual as the person, but do they recognize that they've changed dramatically as well, or?
They may or may not, but at this point, you know, I mean, some of them will, you know, they'll feel it very strongly, and others will be, they're not going to care, because this is where they are. This is their life now, especially when you have someone who's lost a spouse of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. Because remember, they've been one flesh all this time. A part of them has died. If you take a look at the spiritual dynamic of that, a part of them has died too.
Yeah, well, okay.
I mean, really. So, you know, we talk about, just think about a couple who've been married for years, and they have these little routines in their family. You know, I can remember sitting with an older fella, and I went over to have coffee with him one morning, and his wife had passed about 2 weeks before, and he's just sitting there. We were standing there at the kitchen counter, and I walked in and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he goes, "Who's going to cut the banana?" What? Who's going to cut the banana? They had a morning routine. She would get down the poles. He would pull out the cereal. She would get out the milk. He would pour the milk, and she would slice the bananas. That was their routine. And he's standing there, and he says, "Who's going to slice the bananas?" He was lost.
So the lesson is, don't make routines.
Well, we have to understand that we do establish routines by God's design, and we're not those kinds of comfort-giving routines are actually good. But when we lose someone, that gets disrupted, and so everything now has to adjust and change.
And Warren, in that, do you think that he was really in a quandary, or the loss was just so incapacitating or decapitating, even though he knew he would have to cut the banana? It was like, I can't fathom being the one to cut the banana because my banana cutter's not here.
Part of it, but it was more of he was realizing the ramifications and the ripple effect in absolutely area of his life that his wife was. Nothing was going to be the same.
Yeah. And that's one of the significant pieces that they're grieving, is exactly that. Their life is not going to be the same. Not only are they going to miss them, but all the nuances of the ins and outs of the way they did life. There's going to be a new normal.
Right. Well, and Kelly moves into talking about the cultural influences on this. One of the reasons that cultures develop the rituals and stuff around dealing with loss and death and all of that is to help people make that adjustment into life without that person any longer.
Yeah.
So we are saying like those cultural practices it's like a demarcation line, like they physically and visually see that they've stepped to another world now, and it helps them. Is that what
that's a big part of it. Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, so leading into that culture, routines, we talked a bit about that. I don't have any examples fresh out of my brain. It was part of our training we had to go through, but there's a whole lot of routines and different rigid ceremonies, rituals, cultural norms regarding death can influence how a person interacts in grief. So we talked about that a little bit. The Eastern cultures tend to really celebrate life and pause everything to help in the passing for those who are still surviving, to help deal with the death.
Well, there's some really fascinating burial rituals from around the world, both ancient and modern. Of course, some of the most famous ones, the Egyptians and stuff like that, but you've got all kinds of them, and there's many today.
Excuse me, sorry, couldn't mute fast enough.
But it's all about adjusting. It's all about cementing in their thinking that life is now different. My life is now different because this person's life has ended, or their life here has ended, depending on how they look at it. And so it's a way to remember, funerals and memorial services are for the people who are left behind. That's the purpose of them. People say, "Well, I'm not going to the funeral. I didn't really like the guy." Okay, but what are your thoughts about the family that he's leaving behind? See, you're not going for him, you're going for them.
I can really kind of feel that myself personally right now, because with my mom, we opted not to have a service. And I think I kind of spearheaded that because, they're in their 90s, which means there's not many of their friends left. And they're, so how are they going to, and my mom had dementia for a couple, it's just, so it was like, but it was always my hope to do something at the graveside, just the family and maybe a few close, friends after the fact. Well, I've just been unsuccessful at being able to get people together. My dad doesn't want to go because he doesn't want to hurt. And every attempt that I've had to do this, something has come up where the people that are important to me, because I just want to honor her memory. And it's been, and I feel bad that we're not getting to honor her memory, you know. And so I know exactly that what you're saying, Warren, it's for the people that are alive. So I guess I'm one that wants people, you know. And then my daughter was like, well, Mom, maybe you're just supposed to go by yourself. And I was like, well, no, I want to honor her memory, you know. So
the thing is you're the one with the memory. Most people, most of the other people don't have that memory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough too, about the memory, and I'm going to bring this up separately, but I'll bring it up now since I have the mic. When I am grieving my mom, when grief arises within me, I totally do not visualize in my head her dementia state. I remember when I grieve her more alert, my mom, who I knew as my mom. So when I see her face in my mind,
because that's who you lost. You didn't lose the other.
Yeah, and so when I grieve my mom, that's the thought that comes up.
Right, you grieve the version of the one you lost.
Some of that, Dan, is that you probably didn't feel you had permission while she was here and in her dementia state to grieve that you've lost that mom. And now that she is gone, you can grieve it completely, right? There's probably a part of you grieving it as she was still here and you had the challenges of caretaking and all of that. So, yeah. Yeah,
there's that combination of, I was grieving the loss of my mom who I knew, but I couldn't completely grieve.
Yeah, you can until they're gone.
Yeah. Because then you almost feel guilty because, well, she's still there somewhere, you know?
Yes. So. Almost like you don't have permission. Yeah. Let's get through the next few. Yeah. So behavioral expressions. So different rituals, dancing, food, celebration of life, etc. Children tend to act out destructively because they don't know what else to do. I have a lot to say about children and grieving. Warren, I sent you that. I don't know if you gave that to them or not. Cognitive expression.
I didn't get a chance. I was in counseling all day long.
That's okay. You get a pass. Cognitive expression, so how a person perceives things. Memory loss is really common when somebody's going through really deep grieving. Some of that's from the trauma of the loss. Some of that's because of everything going on, trying to process their emotions, feeling sluggish. We might even, people definitely going into some depression. Hallucinations. So how many of you have said, oh, I saw their spirit or their ghost, right? Vulnerability. So they feel very exposed, very vulnerable. So in the story that Warren shared about the gentleman who lost his wife and he didn't know he had to come up with a whole new routine. That place of vulnerability is very real. Sometimes just helping, those that are grieving, come up with the simplest, this is the new normal. Well, how do you think you might do that now? Not in a pushy way, but sometimes just offering another way of doing things than what they've done up to this point can be incredibly helpful because they really can't think of anything. And if they think of anything, some people will feel like that's actually dishonoring of the person who they've lost. So expectations in grief. Do you want to talk about that a bit? So what comes up for me in that, thinking about expectations and grief, are people have an idea of how they're going to feel, right? When they've experienced something, but the reality is we've never experienced it before because it's a new situation, a new person, they're in a different place. So grief is never the same. And sometimes that can add complications to the process of grief.
Can also have expectations of other people, how other people are supposed to react to us or respond to us or our loss, or how they're supposed to grieve. in the face of this loss. Because remember, grief is extremely emotional, okay? And when emotions are running strongest, rationality and reason are weakest, right?
I need to can I circle back to ask something that Kelly you brought up?
Sure.
You said when people think that they see the lost one, it's a hallucination. I would not automatically assume that. I would automatically assume it was the demonic showing.
Not necessarily. It can actually be an emotional projection for trying to find a way to make peace with it.
Okay, but so it could be either or then?
Yeah, but we have to understand that.
And I never heard of it being a hallucination, so that's really insightful. I mean, I never ever realized that. That's all my only paradigm was, well, we know people don't show up, so it has to be the demonic. So I didn't realize.
But again, that's a false dichotomy.
Well, I mean, so this is helpful. I mean, this is good.
Yeah, because when people are seeing ghosts and things are happening, that is demonic. But if somebody believes that they saw Dad or whoever, standing off in the that could have been a spirit, but it very well could have just been something in their mind. Because we have to remember that our conscious mind, our thinking, and our non-conscious mind don't always cooperate well with each other, and the lines get blurred under deep, heavy emotional stress.
So when I remember something I vividly recall, when the night I told my parents that I was pregnant with my son, and I was very strategic when I told my parents, because I knew my dad slept in the buff, and so I knew I was going to tell him when he was in bed so he wouldn't jump. So I didn't know what his reaction was going to be, but I knew he wouldn't jump out of bed naked. So I figured I was relatively safe telling them in bed. So they were in bed, and my mom told me the next day or next few days or whatever, that after I had told them and I had gone to bed, that her mom appeared to her and told her that it was going to be okay. So now, probably when I recalled that, up until just right now, when I recalled that, I would think, oh, that was probably the demonic. But now hearing this, what we're just hearing, that could have very well been a hallucination that she, and more than likely a hallucination that she had.
It's how she's going to make sense. If you take that dynamic and exponentially shatter it into a whole bunch of pieces, you have schizophrenia.
Well, think about what it's doing, right? It's in that case, it's bringing comfort, right? Rather than her feeling overwhelmed, it's bringing comfort.
Yeah, it comforted her. Yeah.
And probably you too, a little bit. I don't know about your grandma, but
I didn't know her. She died before I was born. So
So my father passed away when I turned 7 days after I turned 18. So there was a time, I think it was a deep longing of his presence and his absence. So it was a dream that I had. It was very very distinct, very vivid, that he actually was in the coffin, and he woke up and get off the coffin, and I was so happy, and then I woke up. So where would that be in this?
That's a dream. That's a completely different place.
But why was it a subconscious longing?
Yeah, absolutely. You're trying to say this isn't real. This didn't really happen. And so your non-conscious mind is trying to resolve that. That's what the non-conscious mind does when we're asleep. It tries to resolve the things we haven't been able to resolve when we're awake. That's what dreams are about.
Okay. Mine is a little different. So my mom passed away, and in my dream, I knew it was a dream. But something strange happened because I wrote a song, and that never happens. You know, the songs, the words all came very easily. How was that possible?
Because everything coalesced at a time when it just flowed together, and the normal inhibitions weren't there. You weren't logically thinking about it. You weren't trying to, it wasn't flowing. It wasn't coming with that sense of, you know, other people are going to see this or hear this or judge this, or it was just straight out of your heart. And that's how God made you.
What's interesting, so when I shared that with my siblings, I sensed a tinge of jealousy.
Okay.
Like, hey, you're doesn't mean that you're closer to her than we are, you know, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and you just have to leave that alone. Yeah, their opinions are not your business.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep pressing forward.
You just say yes and start a
You know what,
war.
I tell you what, this would be a good place for us to take a break.
Yes.
Come back in 10.
10. Intensity, moving right along. So we've kind of touched on this already. The depth and power of the emotion will definitely be governed by the individual, the circumstances, what else might be going on. One of the things, kind of turning a little bit from just grief being about death, you know, I do a lot of work with trauma survivors, abuse survivors. Warren does just a little. And we talk a lot about grief, a lot about the things that never were, never will be, you know, establishing, you know, what has been normal for a person for quite some time, letting ideas and, you know, self-protectedness, that kind of stuff, to let it die, you know, and grieving that self-protectedness was created out of an abusive system or a trauma system. So just recognize that when you're working with people, it's not always going to be grief showing up because of death, right? There's different kinds of death. So you want to say more about that?
Yeah, think of it this way. Think of someone who lost a finger at work, okay? And they like playing saxophone on the weekend. There's other losses that they've now experienced because of loss of a finger.
Mm-hmm.
And what if it's something that really, it was a way they were able to, you know, really connect with their thoughts and their emotions and process through their week, and, you know, so there's so many other things that can be factors that can be going on that it's just a finger. You've got 9 more. Please be quiet. Don't talk anymore. Okay. Those kind of trite responses are not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, understanding also that that intensity can come in waves, literally like waves of the ocean. You know, you can be standing, you know, mid-thigh deep in the ocean, and the waves be gentle, and all of a sudden you've got one that is like you're running from it because it looks like it wants to eat you. That's what can happen emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
It can just suddenly be overwhelming because the ramifications and the ripple effect and just all the permutations of the loss, and I'm losing this, I've lost this, and all of a sudden, who's gonna cut the banana?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that, like Kelly said, we have to make sure we move away from just focusing on grief over the loss of someone through death. Raul mentioned someone losing a job. What if that's that's the job that they started working for that company when they got out of high school, and now they're in their 50s, and suddenly they've lost that job.
Mm-hmm.
Even their identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily an idol, but I mean, they don't know anything else.
Right.
Their life doesn't make sense without that job, without going to that company every single day the way they have for over 40 years. So we have to understand that grief is a way, like Kelly mentioned at the very beginning, is that grief is the way that we process through life and adapt to becoming accustomed to life without what or who we lost.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and some of that can be really complicated when you've got somebody that has had a lot of trauma and a lot of catastrophic events in their life. I think it's appropriate to share here. One of the most significant things that Warren did in my life was help me pull apart the pieces from the time that I was 8 through 11, because we had lost our house to a house fire twice, and I'd never been given permission to process that, not to know how to even grieve that. What was I grieving exactly? There was a whole lot to unpack in that short span of time of my childhood. So that being frozen place, you may have people that come in and they're like, well, I just don't feel. So one of our, what is the intensity of the grief that you're feeling? Sometimes they don't know, right? They don't have words because they've never been allowed to feel. So that might be something that you're helping somebody unpack, give language to what's going on for them.
Yeah.
And that can be it. And I've watched this happen many times sitting with people, that is a really significant doorway where they've lost something or someone or went through a pretty significant traumatic event years ago and never been able to unpack it, and feeling like it's okay as a believer that, I trust God, but I don't understand why this is still impacting me, right?
And one of the things that's helpful in that is using that third person hypothetical. So if you were sitting across from someone, a friend, and they were sharing that experience from their childhood with you, what kind of things might you anticipate that they would think or feel as that 8-year-old or that 10-year-old, or, and get them to see it as, okay, if I was sitting and listening, so they take themselves out of it. And they're actually able to, a lot of times, connect with what is reasonable, because they've come to believe that what they were thinking and feeling wasn't reasonable, which is why they weren't allowed to grieve.
And some of that not reasonable, I mentioned earlier, a couple women that I walked alongside, who were walking alongside other women. One of them ended up in front of me because she had gone through pretty significant trauma about a year ago, where her spouse had tried to take their baby and got the whole family involved in it. And the very well-meaning Christians in her world, very legalistic. Okay, well, you need to forgive him. No understanding that this is her first baby. All that is wrapped up in that, her being encouraged to go back and, reconcile with her husband. So a whole lot to unpack in that. And until we were able to sit down, she hadn't had anybody to just express all of the grief and all of the PTSD that she was experiencing from that. So it can show up in a lot of different ways. And you may be the first person that really just wants to hear their story, that can help give them language to understand what's going on for them, that it doesn't make them a bad Christian, that they're not doing God right or something like that.
Would you say that grief is also connected with, like, say, a graduation from high school, where you're onto a different world now?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be grief?
Absolutely.
Can be.
Yeah.
Can be.
Transitions of life. I think, I don't know if men experience this the same as women, but I think women experience transitions of life pretty deeply. So one of them that I've, again, had to walk through myself, and I've walked others through, is I now have adult children. So they don't need me the same way that they used to need me. The relationship looks differently. So there's a grieving in that as well, as they step into their new role. Yeah.
We saw that with our youngest daughter, because when she graduated from high school, we eventually moved away from that town that she grew up with, and she was defiant. She didn't want to leave. In fact, what happened was she decided to live with her friends who were in the town that we were from. So we, that's when she was catapulted to being an adult. And then to add to the grieving, she also lost her pet. So,
Yeah.
She really was lost at that time. And I can understand that now.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and those are legitimate losses.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so grief, why it might say, well, it's just a pet, or it's just a dresser for clothes, or we don't get to determine the value
Right.
for someone else, and the value that person places on the person or thing that they've lost.
Mm-hmm.
Also will be a determining factor with the intensity and the duration of the emotion that they feel and the grief that they experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was so strong that even our Christmas decorations that we gave away or sold because we were moving, she blamed us, telling us that we shouldn't have given those things away. That's part of her childhood. Which
But and the thing is that we might say, well, it's silly to be that emotionally connected to those things. Why? Why is that silly? Because you don't feel that connected to them? Is that why? Because we have to be careful not to project on other people our frame of reference and our standard.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get really judgy when it comes to that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So duration, this is always a fun topic when it comes to grief. So how long should someone grieve? There's no master matrix, right? There's no set amount of time. We talk about, is it in the next, do we have that graph here? Talking about healthy grieving and
the helping model, that one?
Yeah. That's not in this lesson.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's on the last page. Yeah.
You're going to talk about that. I don't know how to talk about the whole thing.
Okay.
There's always a certain amount of grief that will be with us our whole life. And that can be hard for some people to connect with if they haven't ever had any significant loss. Yeah, we'll talk some more about that. So it ebbs and flows, right? Like Warren said, it can be, like waves coming and going. Sometimes, I think Jan, I heard you mention just out of the blue, your dad will just be sobbing, that's how grief is. That's how it works. And that ebb and flow can range from anger to despondency to, there's just a whole gamut of emotions that come up from that.
There's two things that I've experienced with this grief with my mom that, and I even with my great grandmother, is guilt. So, and I don't think we talked about that, but is guilt of, like with my great grandmother, I walked into she lived with us, and I was a teenager. I was a junior, I think, in high school. I walked into her room and she was laying across her bed, and I just thought she was ignoring me. So I got mad at her and I left out. And then I went and said, "What's wrong with grandma? She's just laying on her bed ignoring me." So my dad immediately goes downstairs. Well, she was having a stroke. so I felt guilty, you know, I felt guilty. And then, and God was, and then off and on, with my grieving with my mom is like, you know, I have felt guilty, like, thinking of times that I got short with her because I was exhausted, and her dementia was just being her dementia, Alzheimer's. And, you know, I should have been more, the shouldas. But, you know, you feel like, man, why wasn't I more patient with her? And so those things are what kind of tries to come to the forefront in my grief. It's like, and so I'm sure other people too, you know, you feel guilty. Why didn't I do something different? Why didn't I visit them more? Why didn't I, you know, those.
Yeah.
And then another thing that has come up for me is fear. I experience fear, like I don't want to get old like that. I don't want to have Alzheimer's and pee on myself. You know that. So that's something I'm trying to work through.
Mm-hmm.
And those are very common. Those are very common, especially when you're dealing with that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially dealing with that.
Yeah. And getting to a place where you can have a real honest conversation with God about that. You know, God, you say that there is no condemnation in you of things that I haven't done well, or that I'm feeling, you know, maybe appropriately guilty or not appropriately guilty. You know, help me to see this the way that you see it. Help me to give to you what you need me to give to you, so that I'm not carrying this, so that I can get to a place of celebrating, you know, who that person was in our life. One of the things that I end up doing a lot on tip calls is helping people turn, because it's really common for people to feel guilty for still being alive, and they're no longer alive.
Yeah, and we deal with that often. You deal that with consequences of war, what we call survivor guilt.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
I was just gonna share what I heard from the radio one time. A Holocaust survivor. So he was interviewed. I think it was with James Dobson. So he was sharing, and what was so painful when I heard him say, "I'd like to tell my story so that people will not forget what has happened, and it shouldn't be repeated in any one race." But what's so painful to him is that his son would say to him, "Dad, you should forget about it. It's been 50 years, 50 long years. So it's time for you to move on."
Mm-hmm.
So that's the painful part of, you know, lack of support or lack of understanding, maybe from his own family.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's kind of like God in His grace has not caused that child to experience the kind of trauma that his father did, because if he did, he probably wouldn't survive it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but yeah,
it happens a lot.
The gross injustice of that.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you angry, and it turns your stomach at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to understand that we have a huge obligation as representatives, ambassadors for Christ, to not be like that.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus never chastised anyone for grieving loss. The woman they got a funeral procession. She's getting ready to bury her son. Jesus didn't get after her about that. She raised her son from the dead, brought him back to life. That's how we'll solve this, right? But that's not the case, right? That's not the case with others. You know, he didn't chastise people for grieving.
Mm-hmm.
He said, yes, in your grief, yes, you're grieving, but don't forget this. You know, don't forget that this is also at work, that God is in this with you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of move on to this last part. We've already done the discussion part. It's already been woven through this. So
we have. Good job.
We don't need to do that part. So let's look at the helping model. All right. So we take a look at, we've got the stressor over on the left. Now we have to understand when a person experiences a crisis, all right, are they experiencing what we call trauma 1 or trauma 2? Trauma 1 is a single event. Trauma 2 is multiple events. All right, so they can have a single event and another single event, and that can be categorized as multiple events, especially if it happens in a short period of time. So that's what we need to understand, okay? And then what role is stress playing in the crisis that they're experiencing, right? Is it manageable or is it overwhelming? The person is saying, am I alone in this, or do I have help, support? Does anybody understand? Does anybody get this? Am I the only one who sees what's going on here? Am I the only one who understands? That's what's going on with these people. It's questions that they ask. And then we take a look at possible law, or we see that the jiggly line, right? And it's like, how strong or weak are their coping mechanisms? What are the resiliency factors, right? And then we say, okay, with all of that, is there a loss or a potential loss? How significant is the loss? Are there multiple losses? And then we say, okay, is there any magical thinking come in? When we talk about magical thinking, it's, well, some of that can be, well, if this had happened, if this had been different, this wouldn't have happened. That's magical thinking. Okay? Mm-hmm. I could have done something to prevent this. That's magical thinking. Mm-hmm. Okay, especially when you're right, especially when you're dealing with suicides. Right. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. And then we take a look at effective coping and ineffective coping. So as opposed a person coping effectively, ineffectively, or a combination of them, which one of those is gaining ground? Are they adjusting to the losses? Are they utilizing the support that's in place? Is the grief appropriate? In other words, okay, you lost your car keys. To be wailing and moaning as if you lost a loved one is not appropriate grief. But it's also the other way. If you've lost a loved one, to feel like you lost your set of car keys, that's not appropriate grief either, right? And appropriate depression, to be sad and forlorn and agonizing in your soul over loss, that there's an appropriate sadness that goes with that. Okay, we don't say, well, you shouldn't be depressed. No, we need to be, but as an appropriate kind and amount. Is there enough, or is it like too much, if you will? And do they have an accurate view of God in all this? Do they recognize that even though this is horrible, even though this is difficult, God is present. The thing is, they're not going to be there right away. There may be elements of that, but the goal is for them to gain more and more in the effective coping and move away from the ineffective coping of a regret, which is what I regret this, I regret this, I should have this, I should have that, if only I had this, if only I had that, right? That's the regret. And the blame, well, it's her fault or your fault or my fault, it's fault, right? And then there's bitterness. This is a criticalness. This is holding on to unforgiveness and becoming embittered. Sometimes it can be toward the person who died. Why did he die? Well, he shouldn't have died. He should have taken better care of himself, that kind of stuff. Or the doctors should have done a better job, or whatever, right? Because the blame, long-term blame becomes bitterness.
So Warren, is that I would suspect that's very common in suicides, is bitterness can happen, like, why did they kill themselves? Why did they do this? And it can over time. It can over time, because you have to understand that suicide really is the most selfish, self-sovereign act a person can exercise in this life. And there's no remedy for it. There's no undoing it. And so it is extremely selfish. It's all built off of lies, but it really is extremely selfish. And people can become embittered toward that selfish act. And so being able to help them to understand that, yes, this was the most selfish act that a person can engage in.
the thing is that being able to surrender the why of that, because you know, they're not in their right mind. And we're going to talk about this for an entire session, but understanding that that is very much at work. Again, you've got the magical thinking, and then what we call incomplete grieving. They don't allow themselves to really do it. Like Kelly was talking about her story. Her grieving was incomplete. She never felt authorized, never could even connect. There was no time, there was no space, it was not okay. You got to adjust, you got to pick up, you got to move on. Or like the gal she was sharing with, she wasn't allowed to grieve the loss of her father. She grew up in losing her father. That was like this long season of life for her. So again, it was an incomplete grieving.
Can I touch on one more, Warren?
Yeah, go ahead.
That we haven't really talked about, or maybe it's talked about somewhere else and I'm not connecting it. But another one that's been really profound recently, I have a couple women that I'm working with who have some sort of physical, I don't know what you call it, limitation, health reason that causes their bodies to lose babies. And that's a particularly sensitive, a place that I see incomplete grieving show up a lot because people really minimize that.
Yeah, and we have talked about that some. We do talk about that. I can't remember where.
Yeah, I feel like we did talk somewhere, but I can't.
Yeah, but we do talk about the fact that when somebody has a miscarriage, if they miscarry a pregnancy, the pregnancy doesn't go full term. That is a child that's been lost. And even pastors' wives will say to women, well, you can have other children, or you have other children, or shut up. Shut up. You just want to jump on them and, hold the back of their head and cover their mouth and squeeze their nose and get them to be quiet.
Yeah.
Because it's torturous. What have I done wrong?
Yeah.
I need to take better care of what is wrong with me. So they absorb the responsibility for this. I mean, it's like, in 1 Samuel goes back to Hannah, and at the temple, wailing and moaning like she's less than because she can't bear children, right? And then when you have people come in and basically what we call secondarily traumatized.
Yes.
Secondary trauma. They re-traumatize these people by telling, well, it wasn't a real child, or it's not like it was you got to know that. Are you kidding? I have never carried a child in me, but I understand that there is an emotional and neurobiological link between that mother and that gestating child. Okay, that'll be a part of them for their whole lives. That never goes away. And so to treat that as if it's not the real loss of a real child is really heinous.
And I'm also reminded too, Warren, just because several years ago, my pastor and his wife experienced a miscarriage or two. And one day he was very transparent when they were pregnant with their youngest, how fearful he had been waiting to make sure this pregnancy was going to be okay, and how much he had hurt over the miscarriages. And I think that we forget it would be easy for a man to dismiss what he's feeling because he wasn't carrying the baby, but also, the fathers of the child that's miscarried also have their own hurt.
Absolutely. And we deal with that too, where men have experienced abortion as well as the woman who is carrying the child. So yeah, very real. All right, in the time we've got left, I want to talk about the counseling process a little bit, okay? There are several goals that we want to have. The first one is the truth is, even though this happened, and even though this hurts, and although you never wanted this or asked for this, and although this hurts, God was not and is not absent. That's the truth. Okay? So God is in this with you. God does understand loss. As a matter of fact, everything this side of Genesis 3 is how God dealt with his loss of what he intended for his relationship with those created in his image. Okay. The second thing is we have to make sure that there's no judgmentalism on our part. We only know in part. God is the only one who knows fully. Okay? So we don't get to judge. Because remember, whoever sits in the position of judge sits in the position of redeemer. So if we're going to judge that person, that means we're going to also determine what it's going to take for them to be redeemed out of this, for them to redeem themselves. That's not our role. That's not our place. No judging. We have to remember also that the goal is to get them to the place where they're able to understand and accept that this loss is real, that this is now a very real part of their life, and that God wants them to be able to learn to accept this new version of life in keeping with the fact that, yes, this loss is real. And over time, the depth of the emotional impact and the severity of the emotional impact will be minimized. But we have to understand it never completely goes away. Okay? Like the example I gave you last week, you got someone who, 40 years before lost a child he never met, an unborn child. Okay? Well, that would be different than actually having held the child, but it's still a loss that every once in a while questions and just that sense of loss rise up. And we have to remember that when a person heals of anything, the loss of innocence, the loss of trust, the loss of being able to rely on, all kinds of losses. As a person heals, that doesn't mean they're restored to pre-trauma or pre-loss condition. Okay? What healing does is says, look, I am now living a different version of life, and I'm a different version of myself than I was before this, and than my life was before this. And I have to understand that because of this, I am now and for the rest of my life will be a different version of me as a result of this. There's nothing bad or wrong in me for that. And understanding that all loss is a result of sin with a capital S, right? Sin is an infection, it's a cancer. And it is the one thing that it determines, the determining factor that drives all loss. Okay? If people didn't sin in the first place, loss would have never been experienced. Because people did sin and continue to sin, loss has become a very normal part of life, but it is unnatural. It's become normal, but it is unnatural. Okay? God never intended us to experience loss. And we have to be careful that people say, well, if only I had this, or only they hadn't, if only they, no, we don't do that. If only. No. Okay. So 4 things we want to look at as the counselor's heart. The first one is you've got to surrender expectations. You've got to surrender your expectations of how this is supposed to look, how they're supposed to process it, how long it's supposed to take. Okay? You're there as an agent of God's grace and truth to walk alongside them. Okay? Not to fix them, not to drag them kicking and screaming into being healed, not to chase them with a stick, but to walk alongside and be a comforter, okay? Encourage. And you have to have generous patience. It takes a great deal of patience. It's real easy to say, well, why aren't they over this already? We never get over these things. We move forward with them and see them differently, but we never get over them. Okay? That's not good language. It's going to take lots of prayer. Lots and lots and lots of prayer. Lord, help me see this person the way you do. Give me your heart toward them. Help me grieve along with them so they're not carrying the grief alone. Grant me empathy. Bring healing, bring relief, bring comfort to them through whatever means you need to, even if it's just the two of you in the still of the night. Really praying for that person, not about them, but for them. And then the last thing, of course, is real, authentic empathy, right? So we've talked about empathy before, and this is an important time to bring that up. But when I say the word empathy, real and authentic empathy, what comes to your mind?
Being a soulmate.
I don't know what that means.
Your griefs, would be the same.
Your what wouldn't be the same?
Your grief, joys, your everything. It's like having a soul or a person that can go.
What would that look like?
If the person's crying, it's okay to cry too. If a person is angry, let that person be angry. Allow the person to be angry.
So
What else would empathy
get angry
do?
with them?
What?
So do you get angry with them?
No, because you're bigger than that. You're strong. You're stronger, not bigger. Stronger.
Okay, but what else would empathy do in that?
I think for me, it's not experience, but having understanding of the person is going through.
We're having a real hard time. You guys, like every other syllable is blanking out.
I said that we might not have the same life experiences, but there's some degree of understanding of the pain or the grief that the person is going through.
Okay. Well, let's go back to what Raul said. What else would empathy do when a person is angry?
Offer yourself as a punching bag.
No.
No?
No, empathy would say your anger is understandable. Mm-hmm. It's reasonable. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm. You're not crazy for feeling what you're experiencing.
No. That's what empathy does. Say, you know, I've never experienced what you have. I've never experienced this myself. But I can tell that this has hurt you deeply. That's what empathy does.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you give them permission to feel what they're feeling instead of.
Well, you're validating it.
Yeah, there we go. That's the word. Yeah.
Yeah, you're validating it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not
trying to fix it or minimize it.
Not fix it, not minimize it. You're not shooting them.
Don't give them a sandwich.
I remember somebody told when he lost his son, his best friend came knocking at the door, and he shouted at his friend, "Get out! I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to meet anyone. I don't want to speak to anyone. But the friend just insisted on just being with him, entered the house, and for days, this guy just didn't say anything. He was just there.
Mm-hmm.
And of all the people who helped him, that silent man was the one who did it.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of silence in biblical counseling.
And what do we say about silence?
Told him.
It's not your enemy. Silence is not your enemy. Good. So, any final thoughts or questions before we wrap it up?
I just